In the late 60s and early 70s, in the middle of the fierce battle, Vietnam was considered the place to be and even a career starter for many of today's world-renowned journalists. This generation of those braving the battlefields, however, was mostly dominated by men. And while women journalists today are no longer a rarity or a novelty, in Vietnam in the 60s and 70s, women journalists certainly wore. In our Talk Vietnam this week, we get the chance to meet one of those trailblazer figures of women war journalists, and her name is Edith Lederer. Hello, Edith. Thank you so much for being on our show today.
I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
So you're back here in Vietnam right on the occasion, marking the 40th anniversary of peace in Vietnam. So how does it feel to be here at this historical moment?
It's always fascinating to be back in Vietnam because Vietnam was such an important part of my life. It launched my career as a foreign correspondent and a war correspondent. And I've really enjoyed coming back. This is my 6th visit, and every time I see the country changing, progressing, getting more dynamic economically, and having been there during the war, it's really heartening to see that peace has made such great strides for many Vietnamese people.
And before we talk more about Edith, let's take a look at her biography in the following clip.
Edith Lederer, a New Yorker, started working for Associated Press, or AP, in 1966. Back then, she was one of the few women covering hard news at the agency. Her connection to Vietnam began 2 years in, when she started covering student riots against the Vietnam War in Berkeley, California. She had been a journalist for 6 years when she became the AP's first full-time female reporter, sent to the then Saigon in 1972. Here for nearly a year, Lederer covered on-ground feature stories on war casualties, efforts towards a peace agreement, and combat soldiers' daily lives. Lederer's experiences in Vietnam laid the groundwork for her future career as a foreign correspondent. She became the first woman to head a foreign bureau for the AP in 1974. Since 1998, Lederer has been the chief correspondent for the AP at the United Nations in New York.
So can you share with us a little bit about the nature of the returning trip this time?
Well, what's very interesting about this trip is that it's been very different from all the other reunions. The first reunion, which I actually organized with my AP photographer colleague, Horst Fass, who won the Pulitzer Prize for his photos of the war, was in 1995, which was the 20th anniversary of the war. And for that reunion, and then the 25th and the 30th, and even the 35th, we were here. We had wonderful lunches, dinners. We took boat rides down the Saigon River. But what's so interesting about this reunion is that the Foreign Ministry this year has actually put together a program for us and really taken us to see a lot of the new Vietnam.
Yes. what about the old hacks? I know you come back and you see the old hacks a lot. Tell us a little bit about the old hacks.
Well, the old hacks is sort of a funny name that I have to admit I had nothing to do with. But a hack is, in slang English, is the name for a journalist, sort of a more like a tabloid journalist. And so when we started doing these reunions, some of the guys got the idea of doing an email site so that we could communicate. And it's called the Old Hacks Network. And if you're an old hack, you get all of these incredible emails about things from the past and things from the present that happened in Vietnam and also Laos and Cambodia.
Mm-hmm. Now, I believe this is not the first reunion. You know, you actually were part of the co-organizers for the meeting 10 years ago during the 30th anniversary of the end of the war. So how strong is the network of foreign journalists who once covered the Vietnam War?
I think because of the length of the war and the fact that it spanned such a long time, from the mid-60s to the mid-70s, you actually had several different generations of war correspondents. You had correspondents from World War II. Mm-hmm. Wow. You had correspondents who covered the Korean War.
Wow.
Who were here. They were the real veterans. And then you had a lot of young correspondents, including people like me, just starting out on their careers as foreign correspondents. But the one thing that wars do, and especially I think the earlier wars, as opposed to perhaps the Gulf Wars and the Iraq Wars, because they were shorter, it bonded this whole group together. So the Vietnam War correspondents have remained like a family. Mm-hmm. And even if you don't see people for many months or many years, you just fall back into being part of that family.
Yes. Now tell me a little bit about what happens during these old hacks meetings. What do you guys do or talk about?
The reunions, well, basically the ones that Horst and I organized, what we do, and this is basically followed through. We would meet for cocktails in some old familiar place, like the rooftop of the Rex, the top of the Caravel, and we would then all go out to dinner. We'd go to Vietnamese restaurants, we'd go to Cholon, and at least for, I think, the past 3 reunions, though not this year, we've rented a boat and had a dinner cruise down the Saigon River. Wow. And, you know, that always brings back a lot of memories, because during the war you really couldn't do anything like that because there was snipers and fire on the river, so it was a pretty dangerous place.
This year's reunion of the Old Hacks has brought together many former war journalists from all over the world right here to Ho Chi Minh City. It's an incredible experience to witness their bond still strong after decades of covering the war together in Vietnam. Let's take a look at this in the following report.
A reunion of Vietnam War correspondents in the heart of Ho Chi Minh City. 40 years after the end of the war. Tim Page is a veteran photographer who was based in Vietnam during the late 1960s. For Tim, who nearly died after 4 injuries in Vietnam, there is a history and a thread that connect these journalists after all these years.
The same memories, the same friends. We come together and it's like yesterday. We were very close during the war. Most other wars, the Second World War, Bosnia, people have not kept this spirit. This is something that is unique to the Vietnam conflict, which is a nice feeling that we start something important.
This connection has kept reunions a tradition for the old hacks.
The correspondents who covered the Vietnam War have been doing reunions ever since the 20th anniversary, every 5 years. We talk about the old times, of course, and our friends who are no longer with us. And that's always quite sad. But we also talk about how dramatically Vietnam has changed.
We're commemorating the reunification of Vietnam, the end of the war. That's the main thing. And then it's a chance for all of us correspondents to get to see each other, because we're all over the place, different parts of the world. In those days, many of us were competitors. Now we're all friends. It's great seeing everybody, and especially everyone looking healthy and getting around fine. You know, we're getting on there in years. We don't know 10 years from now if we'll make the 50th anniversary, so this is kind of important to us.
The Old Hacks trip back to Vietnam has also seen the group visit historic sites of significance to the war and to their work in particular, like the Reunification Palace in Ho Chi Minh City. Reunions like these are valuable occasions for the former correspondents to recount memories of their days reporting in Vietnam.
Now that we're on the subject of nostalgia, can you tell us a little bit? Let's rewind the hands of time and go back and tell us a little bit about how you became one of the first female correspondents during the Vietnam War.
AP every year would ask all of their reporters, basically, what do you want to be? What's your ambition? I always wrote that I wanted to be a foreign correspondent, but this was in the mid-60s, and AP did not have an American woman foreign correspondent at that time. And the reason was that in order to be a foreign correspondent, you had to work on the foreign desk in New York. Only at that time, we had a foreign editor who refused to have a woman on the foreign desk. He did not believe that women had what it took to cover big breaking stories, wars, disasters, and, you know, I'm happy to say that so many women, including yourself, have proven him so wrong.
I'm glad that was the case, yes. But let's go back before that a little bit. Now, you got a ticket. You bought yourself a ticket, a Pan Am ticket. Tell us a little bit about this ticket.
Okay. I had been to Europe. I had never been to Asia. And I was working for the AP in San Francisco. And I talked one of my roommates, who was a teacher, into buying a Pan Am ticket with me, and at that time you could get an around-the-world ticket.
Wow.
And stop every single place that Pan Am stopped. And of course, it was the height of the Vietnam War. This was 1971.
Yes.
And we decided to concentrate on Asia, and Pan Am had lots of flights to then Saigon, Asia, and of course to Saigon. Yes. So we decided to stop in Saigon without telling our parents. We told them that we were going to Singapore and Hong Kong and Bangkok and New Delhi, but we just sort of forgot about mentioning Saigon.
Mm-hmm. Now, you did mention that you chose Saigon to be a war tourist, as you mentioned that term many times.
Yes.
Now, what did you witness in Saigon back then?
Well, working for the AP, when my friend Nancy and I got to Saigon, we were immediately adopted by the guys in the AP bureau in Saigon. Yes. And they took us to the 5 o'clock follies, which were the daily military briefings that the U.S. military command held. And they also got us onto a helicopter ride over the Mekong Delta.
Wow.
And that was quite fascinating because there was some firing going on, not too close to us, but close enough. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, you look down at this very placid, very peaceful, beautiful jungle area, and you think, oh, you know, it's gorgeous, and then all of a sudden, poof, you know, the artillery starts going off, and you realize you really are in a hot war zone.
And at that moment in time, you know, you as a woman, like your international desk editor, did not want to send women abroad, but yet at the same time, you still chose to go abroad to Vietnam, and somebody sent you abroad. Who was that person?
The person who, there are two people who are really responsible for me going to Vietnam. AP's then bureau chief, Richard Pyle, had been lobbying the president of the AP to send a woman to Vietnam.
Yes.
I have to say that by that time, in 1971, there were, I wouldn't say a lot of women, but let's say there were 6 or 7 or 8 women, and some working for major news organizations, including the New York Times, UPI, our big competitor, NBC News. So there were quite a number of women. I only found out in, 2002, after the first Gulf War, when Richard Pyle and I were both in Saudi Arabia, and he said to me, "Do you know how you ended up in Saigon?" I said, "Yes, I got a phone call from Wes Gallagher, the president of the AP, asking me if I wanted to go to Vietnam." Mm-hmm. He said, no, that's not how you got to Vietnam. You got to Vietnam because I had been lobbying for a woman, and after I met you, when you came through on your Pan Am around the world ticket,
yes,
I wrote to Wes Gallagher and said, "That's the woman I want." So I got sent to Saigon without ever working on the foreign desk.
So tell me a little bit about your first days arriving in Vietnam. How was that like?
You know what? It was, everything buzzed, I think. I mean, I still can picture getting out of the airport and this thousands of motorbikes and sort of dust being churned up in the air, and everybody rushing. Everybody was rushing to go somewhere. And I kept saying to myself, you know, I have to figure out how this whole place works.
Right. And it wasn't anything you expected, right?
It wasn't. Well, since I had been there in 71, I had a little inkling of what it was going to be like. Yes. But it wasn't, I didn't really realize that the time that I arrived in Vietnam was actually quite a turning point. I arrived in Vietnam like just a few days before Henry Kissinger, who was then the National Security Advisor in the U.S., declared that he thought peace was at hand. Mm-hmm. And of course, it didn't happen so quickly, but the fact that I sort of went expecting to be really focusing on the military side, and instead I ended up really writing a lot of the diplomatic side of what was going on in Vietnam.
So you were one of the very, very few female journalists in the battlefield, during the war. You're the first female journalist that the Associated Press sent abroad. So how was it being a woman covering the war, and what were some of the perks and downsides?
I've always believed that women have certain advantages and they have certain disadvantages. But one of the advantages for women in war is that, particularly at that time in Vietnam, there weren't many American women around the battlefields and around Saigon in any way. And so men were always interested in talking to me. Mm-hmm. And I could ask any questions because they never expect women to know as much about military battlefields, what's really happening. And of course, at that time, this was a learning curve for me. The downside is that some men will try and put one over on you, mm-hmm. and try and make it very plausible. Mm-hmm. And that happened to me once. Mm-hmm. It was a hard lesson.
Right.
And I think that, we all learn from our mistakes.
Mm-hmm. So what were some of the stories that you covered during your time as a war reporter?
Well, I covered such a variety of stories, and I think that was part of what made my time here so interesting. I wrote, one of the first big stories that I wrote was there was very serious rocketing near Tan Son Nhut, near the airport. I went out with one of our photographers, and we found a very sad story that one of these rockets had actually gone through the roof of a house right near the edge of the airport. And a very young woman who was maybe 20 years old had died. And by the time we got there, she was laid out on her bed. There were candles on the side, weeping relatives. And I looked at her and I thought to myself, she was a little younger than I was at the time, and she was someone who apparently wanted to get married and have a family. And, it really did bring home to me the personal and civilian cost of the war. Another story that I covered was, I think Americans didn't really appreciate the high death toll that the war was taking on the Vietnamese. Right. And I went and found through one of our Vietnamese staff a woman who had lost 3 sons in the war, and she had 5 young children. And her husband had died, and no means of support.
So you came up close and personal with the war. So what did you witness, and did you ever feel like it was becoming too much for you to handle back in the day?
I never felt that Vietnam was too much for me to handle. I'm an adventurer, and I witnessed some close artillery strikes.
Were you at any point in time during your time in Vietnam, were you scared for your life? I mean, you were covering a war with artillery is right beside you.
I was blown out of bed one night. I thought that my apartment building had been bombed, but actually what it turned out was that an ammunition dump on the other side of the Saigon River had blown up. Oh, wow. And all that ordnance, that ammunition exploded for like a whole day. You know, being out in the field on occasion, things got very close, but I was very lucky.
As one of the pioneering female war reporters in her agency, Edith Lederer has a passion to voice support for women in the news industry. War Torn: Stories of War by Women Who Reported the Vietnam War. That is the title of a book she co-authored with 8 others. The women recount their experiences and hardships, but above all, the complete possibility of being a woman and a journalist in the heart of war. Lederer's career post-Vietnam is perhaps one of the most solid examples of this belief. Along with more and more female colleagues, she went on to cover conflicts in Darfur, Iraq, Kosovo, the Congo, Sierra Leone, and East Timor. Lederer, whom colleagues lovingly call Edie, is a source of inspiration at her work.
She likes nothing more than finding news and reporting it, and she does it with this little smile. And she's typing, she types, and she'll read out loud what she's typing, and she'll say, "Yeah, you like it? You like it?" And then she'll do some more. She's just, she's just Edie. There's no one else quite like her.
Edith Lederer is the recipient of many prestigious awards.
The International Women's Media Foundation presents its Lifetime Achievement Award to Edith Lederer.
She received this message from her colleague at the UN, Secretary General Ban Ki-moon.
Congratulations, Edie. Another award in your outstanding career. Many people remember your bravery in Vietnam. Edie, you cover the most important issues facing our world. War and peace, of course, but also the health of mothers, the diseases that kill children, the silent emergencies like hunger and poverty that are destroying millions of lives. You shine a light in the darkness. You make a difference with your work.
Now in her early 70s, Lederer still believes there is much to be done for future female correspondents like herself.
What's been happening at the UN? I think that there are still many doors for women to go through, and a glass ceiling that's still pretty hard, not just in the news business, but elsewhere. I'm going to keep pushing, and I hope that the world will keep pushing to ensure that women have an equal place in the sun.
From the then Saigon to New York, Lederer has gone from defying the odds against women of her time to becoming an influential figure for aspiring female reporters and all journalists alike.
So in your book, War Torn, the book that you co-authored with 8 other female correspondents in Vietnam, you have referred to Vietnam as your first war and something that launched you towards becoming a foreign correspondent. So what do you think the Vietnam War meant to you?
If I look back on my life, it really shaped my career. I had been a journalist for 6 years before I came to Vietnam, so I wasn't a novice. But it really whetted my appetite to remain a foreign correspondent, remain overseas, and to really try and tell the stories of what wars and disasters and all sorts of other things do to people and governments.
Right. So how do you think the war in Vietnam set a precedent for female journalists in the U.S. and in the world?
There had been female war correspondents, certainly in World War II, but the Vietnam War was the first television war.
Yes.
And because it was the first television war, the news coverage was really daily.
Yes.
And almost immediate, pretty fast compared to the past.
Yes.
And so I think that Vietnam actually, as it launched my career, it really launched women into being foreign correspondents and war correspondents. And I say that, I say it because in every subsequent war, there have been many, many more women, which is very heartening.
During her trip to Vietnam this time, Edith visited Ho Chi Minh City, where she was based from 1972 to 1973. She recalled many memories of the past during the times when she was covering the war. Let's follow her footsteps and see what she remembered.
Together with the Old Pac's war correspondent group, Lederer is visiting the historic Cu Chi tunnels. For Lederer, who never came here during the war, the visit has been eye-opening.
Until after the war, till people actually got to go see the tunnel, the vast tunneling network. I don't think people realized, even journalists, how extensive it was.
I first came to the Cu Chi tunnels in 1993 on my first trip back to Vietnam after 20 years. And then they didn't have any of this organized for tourists. So it's quite amazing to see how they've built it up.
For other combat journalists like Tim Page, being back in Cu Chi conjures up many memories.
I first came to this area when it was a war zone in 1965. Close to here, I was wounded the last time. When I come back here, I think, oh, I'm lucky to live. I mean, to me, this is like as close as I come almost to where I died.
As part of the trip back, Lederer and the former correspondents were also taken to see the Vietnam of today, one not only free of war, but also flourishing. Here, the group is visiting a high-tech agricultural farm outside of Ho Chi Minh City.
I've been here in 1995, 2000, 2005, and 2010. And from what I've seen, you know, the economy and the quality of living has just gone up and up and up. And I think that's great for the Vietnamese people.
Trips to such sites offer Lederer and her former fellow reporters a chance to witness the peace and development of present-day Vietnam.
So Vietnam has certainly changed so much ever since the war. So how does it feel witnessing the country now in peacetime, a place where you had only once associated it with the war?
One of the things that I'm always gratified about is first seeing how much economic progress there's been in Vietnam and the better standard of living for most of the people here.
Yes.
And you see that everywhere. And you know, the other thing that as an American makes me quite happy is that there are good relations between the United States and Vietnam. I think they have a lot of common interests, and I hope that that relationship flourishes in the future.
Now, you as a woman journalist back in the day, you witnessed the challenges that women journalists had to face. Now, women journalists are so much more abundant in the world. But what are some of the challenges you see them facing today?
Well, the one big challenge I see women journalists facing today is that there really is still a glass ceiling, particularly when you're talking about management, media. The big players in the media are still the big boys, not the big girls.
Right.
And I think that, you know, one of the things I would like to see in my lifetime is more women in top media positions and being big policy makers. I mean, I'm someone who started out writing on a typewriter, and loads of people don't even know what a typewriter is today. But I think having gone through the digital revolution and seeing online and Twitter and everything that how dramatically the media has changed. Yes. The one thing I would hope was that quality, objectivity, really remain a hallmark of the profession for both women and for men.
As a veteran journalist, what advice do you have for aspiring journalists as well as aspiring women journalists? And how does today's changing media present a challenge or a benefit to us aspiring journalists?
I think that knowledge is very important, and in today's globalized world, the more languages you speak, the more successful you're going to be. And in today's world, you really need multimedia skills.
Yes.
You need to know how to take pictures, do video, write.
Yes.
And so those are really key things. But rather than going to college and studying, or university and studying journalism as an undergraduate degree, I always recommend that aspiring journalists go and, you know, do economics, international relations, politics, science, art. Do something that's going to give you a
holistic
view of the world, and then you can go and get a graduate degree in media studies or journalism or whatever.
Right. Thank you so much, Edith, for coming on to our show today, and thank you for sharing your stories about, your past, your wartime stories in Vietnam, and thank you also for inspiring aspiring journalists like myself and like many other people to continue onto the path of becoming a journalist.
It's been my pleasure, and I've certainly enjoyed being back in Vietnam and talking to you.
Thank you very, very much, and I hope we meet again.
I do too.
That's wrapped up our talk this week with one of the few female war journalists during the war in Vietnam over 40 years ago. I hope that the talk with her has inspired you just as much as it has inspired me, even though many of us have never witnessed the war. And that's it for Talk Vietnam. Thank you very much for tuning in, and until we chat next time, goodbye.